It began in the kind of silence that makes a room feel smaller than it is. The trauma bay lights were too bright, the monitors too sharp, and the voices too loud for anyone to miss the tension building around the bed. A decorated military patient had just been rushed into St. Catherine's Medical Center under a false name. His blood pressure was falling, his breathing had gone shallow, and 3 attending physicians were already talking over one another while a nurse stood at the edge of the bed with her hands still and her eyes fixed on the screen. She saw the rhythm change before the others did. She saw that the drop in pressure did not match the assumption everyone else had already chosen. She said so once, then again, but no one really listened. The loudest consultant in the room, Dr. Adrian Mercer, dismissed her with the kind of polished contempt that was designed to humiliate without leaving evidence. The room rewarded him with the easy laughter that confident men often collect from people who fear them more than they respect them. The nurse they kept calling quiet stepped forward anyway. She looked once at the patient's face, once at the waveform, and then stated with such calm certainty that it made the noise around her feel childish that if they sedated him now, they would kill him. The warning should have stopped the room, but it did not. What stopped the room came a minute and a half later, when the patient's security escort shifted closer. The monitor screamed, Mercer swore under his breath, and a broad-shouldered man in civilian clothes leaned in from the doorway just enough to hear her voice. He did not look at the badge on her chest. He looked at her face. Then, softly enough that only the nearest people heard it, he said a call sign no one in that hospital should have known. He called her Wren, and from that moment the room changed. Before that night, Nora Vale had become nearly invisible by professional design. She had worked at St. Catherine's for 11 months, 6 days, and a little under 4 hours, if anyone had bothered counting. She worked the late rotation most weeks, volunteered for the ugliest shifts, kept her charting immaculate, spoke only when she had something useful to add, and had somehow developed the reputation of being timid in a building that routinely confused volume with authority. St. Catherine sat on the older side of Baltimore, a private medical center wrapped in polished glass, marble floors, donor plaques, and carefully managed prestige. There were really 2 hospitals inside it. One treated patients, the other protected egos. Nora moved through the first one with quiet efficiency, and through the second one like a woman who had long ago learned the cost of being noticed by the wrong people. She wore navy scrubs with no flair, pinned her hair back the same way every shift, clipped her badge high, and walked in soft-soled shoes that made people forget she was near until she was already there. Younger nurses liked her because she never made them feel stupid. Older nurses trusted her because she noticed things early and never dramatized them. Orderlies sought her out when something felt wrong but was hard to name. Residents learned, usually in private and often after embarrassment, that if Nora suggested they should take a second look, they probably should. The physicians, especially the ones who had built themselves into brands, never quite knew what to do with someone like her. Dr. Adrian Mercer knew exactly what to do. He was the kind of cardiothoracic specialist who had turned being difficult into a professional identity. He was brilliant often enough to excuse what was otherwise inexcusable, connected enough to avoid consequences, and charismatic enough that donors laughed at stories that would have gotten other men disciplined. He liked to speak about standards when he really meant hierarchy, and he had taken one look at Nora in her first week and decided she was the sort of nurse who would make his life easier by staying small. At first his contempt came polished. He would ask for updates from one of the more senior nurses when Nora was the one with the chart in her hand. He would ignore her recommendations, then repeat them in his own words 5 minutes later and receive nods for his insight. He would tell residents within her hearing that some staff were very good at following protocols, but should not confuse that with improvisational judgment, and then glance at her as though the glance itself counted as proof. Over time, subtlety bored him. He told her to project her voice because she was in a hospital, not a library. He informed her that confidence mattered almost as much as competence. He suggested she was excellent at tasks and should take care not to mistake that for higher reasoning. None of it was clean enough to report. That was part of his talent. The culture around him made it worse. St. Catherine's rewarded certainty performed in public. Th. Tricks looked like leadership until a real crisis arrived. A young resident could be wrong 3 times in a row and still be called promising if he was wrong loudly enough. A nurse could prevent a medication error, save 20 minutes of drift, stop a complication before it formed, and still be described as solid support staff. Nora never fought to control a room. She simply kept rooms from falling apart. There were small mysteries about her, though. the kind people noticed without knowing how to interpret. She never flinched when helicopters shook the ambulance bay windows. She tied tourniquets with unusual speed during drills. Once, when a former combat medic came through the emergency department after a motorcycle crash and woke up half-conscious and combative, Nora spoke one short phrase in a clipped cadence that made him calm instantly before he was even fully aware of where he was. A thin pale line crossed her left wrist, too clean and precise to be from kitchen accidents or broken glass. On nights when the cafeteria television played footage from overseas deployments, she glanced not at the explosions or the flags, but at exits, rooftops, spacing between vehicles, and the hands of the people in frame. Most people never connected those things because they had no reason to. Chief Nurse Elena Ruiz noticed. She had survived 27 years in hospital administration by paying attention to what others dismissed. She understood talent, danger, silence, and the ways institutions misread all three. Nora's personnel file was unusually thin, not in a suspicious way, but in a deliberate one. Prior experience was listed in broad terms. References came from government email addresses. Continuing education modules were clustered in patterns uncommon for ordinary civilian nursing. One recommendation letter was sealed for executive review only. Ruiz never asked Nora about any of it. She only corrected anyone who made the mistake of calling her timid. In Ruiz's view, Nora was not timid at all. She was economical, and there was a difference. The shift that changed her life began badly and got worse with discipline. There had been a donor dinner upstairs that evening, which meant the executive wing was full of expensive suits, flattering speeches, and administrators pretending illness had the decency to arrive on schedule. The emergency department had already taken 2 construction injuries, an elderly stroke patient and a college athlete with a ruptured spleen. By 9:30, every room was full, and the hallway had begun to look like a compromise between systems and necessity. Nora was in Trauma 2 updating medications when Mercer strode in looking for a case dramatic enough to fit his sense of himself. He found one in Calvin Reese, a middle-aged sanitation supervisor who had collapsed at work. Reese arrived gray-faced, sweating and clutching his chest, with pain radiating to his jaw and blood pressure that shifted in a way Mercer found theatrically suspicious. He decided within seconds that this was a panic episode complicated by noncompliance, the kind of tidy conclusion that made him look decisive. Nora looked at the tracing and saw intermittent electrical alternans. Mercer dismissed it without even turning toward the monitor. She said it again. This time he turned, not because the information mattered to him yet, but because being contradicted by a nurse in front of residents offended his sense of order. The room felt the change immediately. A respiratory therapist and an intern became suddenly fascinated by their equipment while pretending not to listen. Mercer studied the monitor for just long enough to perform patients and then suggested that if a person stared at noise long enough, they could convince themselves of anything. Calvin Reese coughed and his pressure fell again. Nora had already started moving toward the ultrasound cart. She said he needed a bedside echo immediately. Mercer blocked the cart with one hand and asked whether she had misunderstood him. At that exact moment, Elena Ruiz walked in, took in the monitor, the machine, the posture, and Nora's face, and asked what was happening. Mercer smoothed his tone at once and described the moment as an over-enthusiastic nurse attempting to improvise. Nora met Ruiz's eyes and said only that she suspected tamponade. That changed Ruiz's expression in a way Mercer noticed instantly. He demanded the basis for the claim. Nora pointed out the alternating amplitude, the distended neck veins when the patient sat forward, the narrowing pulse pressure, and the fact that he was compensating, but not for long. Mercer exhaled the breath of a man trying to imply superior fatigue and accused her of building a dramatic diagnosis out of fragments. Ruiz told him to run the echo. He resisted for a heartbeat, then stepped aside because openly challenging Ruiz over a portable scan would look petty, and he preferred his cruelty deniable. Nora placed the probe, adjust. The angle froze an image, then another. Even the intern could see the dark rim around the heart. The room went still. Mercer leaned in and suggested it could be artifact. Nora changed windows without explaining herself, took measurements, and handed the probe to a resident, telling him to get the same view. He did, and his face changed color when the same result appeared. Calvin Reese decompensated 6 minutes later. Because the diagnosis had been made in time, because Nora had quietly prepared a tray for the procedure Mercer had dismissed, and because she had already set the team up for the intervention he had delayed, the patient was stabilized before surgery. No apology followed. Mercer gave orders as if the entire sequence had unfolded under his leadership. But the residents had seen her call it. Ruiz had seen him block the machine. The intern never laughed around Nora again. What should have shifted the culture instead provoked Mercer. An hour later, he cornered Nora near the medication room and accused her of enjoying scenes. She told him she had treated a patient. He called it grandstanding. She told him he had been wrong. His jaw tightened because what unsettled him was not that she had raised her voice, but that she had not. He warned her that people with limited roles should avoid inflated views of their own importance. She answered that people with authority should avoid mistaking it for infallibility. He stared at her, surprised less by the words than by the fact that she had spent them at all. Then he smiled, which was worse, and thanked her in a tone that made it clear he now intended to teach her a lesson. By midnight, the emergency department knew Calvin Reese was alive because Nora Vale had refused to be ignored. By 12:15, Mercer had already started rewriting the story. He did it like experienced predators do, not with obvious lies, but with selective emphasis. A concern had been raised. A physician had evaluated. A team had responded. There had been some confusion in roles during a high-pressure moment, and although the outcome was positive, processes needed to be respected. By 1 in the morning, a formal complaint had been filed alleging that Nurse Vale had acted outside her scope, undermined physician leadership in front of trainees, and contributed to team destabilization. It was exactly the sort of bureaucratic phrase that could stain a career if repeated often enough in the right file. Ruiz intercepted the notice before Human Resources could send the formal write-up, but she could not erase the fact that Mercer had filed it. She found Nora in the break room with a cup of coffee she had not touched and told her that Mercer was pushing for suspension before the story settled, because he understood perfectly well that witnesses still remembered the order he had given. Nora sat with that information in the same still way she sat with most things. Ruiz told her she might not be able to stop a short-term suspension if Mercer pressed hard enough. Nora only nodded. Then Ruiz asked if there was anything in Nora's background she needed to know before the matter escalated. A softer person might have heard suspicion in the question. Nora heard concern. She said there was nothing she had done wrong. Ruiz clarified that this was not what she had asked. After a long pause, Nora admitted there were parts of her background that were not built for office gossip. Ruiz asked whether those parts would help her. Nora said maybe. Ruiz asked whether they would hurt her. Nora looked at the untouched coffee and answered that they would only hurt if the wrong people heard them first. Ruiz accepted that and said they would make sure the right people did. That was the moment the night might still have ended as an internal dispute. Then the black SUVs arrived. No sirens announced them. No fanfare justified them. They simply glided beneath the emergency awning while rain tapped against the structure and security guards straightened for reasons they could not explain. A patient came in on a gurney with the anonymity of significance. Plain blanket, no insignia, no visible entourage beyond the minimum required to suggest enormous consequence. He was male, somewhere in his 40s, with a muscular frame gone slack with shock, civilian clothing cut away at the side, deep bruising across the lower thorax, respiratory distress, and perfusion already failing. One escort carried himself like someone trained to kill efficiently, but currently more interested in not losing the man on the bed. The admitting name was Daniel Ross, and everyone in the room knew within seconds that it was false. Mercer saw the level of security and transformed. His voice deepened, his gestures sharpened, and his vanity found a distinguished audience. He entered Trauma 1 with the polished urgency of a man already imagining how the story would sound later when others retold his heroics. Nora came because she was assigned. Mercer almost sent her out on reflex. Then the patient started crashing and workload overruled ego. The escorts remained almost entirely silent except for one instruction, which was simply that the patient had to be saved. Mercer asked about the cause of injury and was told it had been a vehicle rollover. It was not a complete truth. The patient's respirations worsened. Breath sounds were uneven, but not in the pattern Mercer expected. The pressure kept falling. One resident suggested internal hemorrhage. Another prepared sedation. Mercer chose a path quickly because speed looked like control. Nora noticed the mismatch first. The bruising was wrong for the narrative. The pressure curve was wrong for the assumption. The body on the bed was rejecting the clean interpretation the room wanted to impose on it. She told them to hold sedation. Mercer refused. She explained that the patient was compensating around an unstable airway with pressure sensitivity. Mercer ordered him bagged. She said not to. He snapped at her to stop. Then she leaned close to the patient's face, watching not the chest but the tiny panic in the muscles around his eyes. She checked one side of his neck, then the other. Her fingers moved with old familiarity. She listened near the clavicle. She looked once at the security escort, who stiffened as if her gaze itself had brushed classified knowledge. Then she said clearly enough for the room to remember later that if they sedated him now, they would kill him. Mercer turned on her in fury and reached for the sedative anyway. That was when the man in civilian clothes at the doorway heard her voice. He had entered so quietly that almost no one noticed him. He had a broad frame, gray at the temples, a plain dark jacket, and the unmistakable stillness of real authority. He looked at Nora once, and his face changed by a degree. He stepped closer and spoke the call sign under his breath. He called her Wren. Nora reacted only microscopically, but the change in her was unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read people. Her spine settled. Her eyes sharpened. Recognition, not surprise. Mercer missed it because he was still performing outrage. When he demanded to know who the newcomer was, the man did not answer him. He watched Nora instead. Then Mercer demanded authority, and the man finally told him that the only thing that mattered in that moment was that Mercer was about to make the wrong call. It was said with flat control, which was worse than anger. Mercer objected that the treatment area was restricted. The man replied that Mercer was still talking. The resident nearest the bed froze. Nora had already moved. She adjusted the patient's position, signaled for a different airway setup, asked for ultrasound, and named 3 supplies in quick succession. Her voice never rose, yet each instruction landed exactly where it needed to. The staff obeyed before their minds fully caught up, because confidence becomes contagious when it is grounded in real competence. Mercer made one last attempt to retake command by insisting they were not going to deviate based on a nurse's intuition. Nora did not look at him when she answered. She only made it clear that they were not deviating based on intuition at all. They were deviating based on anatomy. The ultrasound came up and confirmed what she had seen. There was a pocket where none should have been, pressure in a space where pressure could not remain, an injury pattern too specific for guesswork and too dangerous for delay. The security escort cursed under his breath. Mercer's face tightened. Nora laid out the next steps with the calm speed of someone laying stones across moving water. She did not dramatize. She did not perform. She corrected a resident's hand placement, instructed a tech to check the pressure every 15 seconds, and made everyone wait for her count. The patient caught a breath, failed to keep it, and began to slip. Nora's left hand steadied, and her right hand worked. The man in the doorway stayed out of her way with the disciplined stillness of someone who knew the difference between intervention and interference. Mercer hovered at the line between salvage and obstruction. He knew enough now to see that she was right. He knew enough to hate that he knew it. Nora recognized the buried pattern inside the noise, bought the patient the exact amount of time he needed, and turned what had looked like an unrecoverable collapse into a narrow but usable window. It was enough for the surgeons. By the time the transport team took the patient upstairs under heavy guard, his vitals were still precarious but no longer free-falling. The resident who had doubted her most stood with gloves half removed and stared at her, as if he had just discovered a new category of human being. Mercer broke first. He asked in a low, venomous tone what sort of prior training she had been pretending not to mention. Nora pulled off her gloves and told him only that it was the kind he should have listened to. The commander asked Mercer for his name. Mercer gave it with offended dignity, and the commander stored it without visible reaction. Chief Ruiz arrived moments later, having heard enough from downstairs to know the night had tipped. She took in Mercer's face, the departing team, the security detail, Nora's posture, and the stranger by the doorway, and then asked the only question that mattered. She wanted to know if the patient was alive. Nora said that for now he was. Ruiz then asked because of whom. A resident answered before Mercer could, naming Nora. The silence after that was almost clean. Saving the patient should have protected her. Instead, it triggered the ugliest part of the night. When people built on prestige feel that prestige starting to crack, they do not always retreat. Sometimes they lunge. Mercer waited until the high-security transfer had gone upstairs and the room had lost its most obvious witnesses. Then he turned the corridor outside Trauma 1 into a stage. He announced loudly enough for the nurses, station, and half the hall to hear that this was exactly the problem with staff who did not understand limits. A lucky improvisation, he said, had become delusion. He accused Nora of endangering 2 patients in one night. Ruiz stepped in at once, but Mercer pivoted toward her without lowering his voice. He framed the events as one case of insubordination and one case of unauthorized intervention under a security-sensitive intake. He suggested that if Ruiz wanted to protect Nora out of sentimentality toward nursing staff, that was her choice, but it would never survive review. Nora could have defended herself point by point. She did not. She had learned in harsher places that when someone is trying to provoke emotion, dignity becomes evidence. She said only that she had documented every observable indicator twice. Mercer replied that she had documented her interpretation. She said she had documented facts. He insisted she had acted outside scope. She answered that she had prevented a fatal error. Then Mercer stepped closer, still smiling, and said the cruelest thing he had said all night. He told her she had only gotten lucky in front of the wrong witnesses. A nurse behind the desk inhaled sharply. Ruiz told him that was enough. Mercer ignored her and demanded Nora's badge and access card, announcing a suspension that he did not actually have the unilateral authority to impose. But institutions teach compliance so effectively that sometimes tone alone becomes action. Several eyes turned to Nora's badge. That was the ritual humiliation he wanted, not merely punishment but diminishment in public form. Nora unclipped the badge and placed it in her own palm, but she did not hand it over. Ruiz told her not to. Nora replied that if this was the process, then the process could happen. Mercer mistook restraint for surrender. Then, because cruelty is never satisfied with one blow when more are available, he said some people were meant to assist, and that the moment they started wanting more, patience became props. That landed not because it was true, but because it was aimed at a part of Nora no one there understood. For the first time all night something older than irritation moved beneath her composure, not anger exactly, but memory. She looked at him for one beat too long and told him he should be very careful what kind of person he reduced in public. Mercer laughed and asked if that was a threat. Nora said no. It was simply the last useful thing she was likely to say to him that night. He extended his hand for the badge. Before she could respond, the automatic doors opened again. The same commander walked back in, no longer alone. With him came a hospital legal representative, a federal liaison no one recognized, and the chief operating officer of St. Catherine's, Martin Bell, still fastening his tie as he hurried down the hall with the expression of a man who had taken a phone call capable of changing his month. Mercer's outstretched hand remained in the air a second too long. It made him look absurd. Bell stopped when he saw the tableau, Mercer reaching, Nora holding her badge, Ruiz set like a shield, staff witnessing everything. He asked what was happening. Mercer immediately began to frame it as an internal matter involving a nurse who had acted beyond her role. The commander cut him off and said that the nurse would remain exactly where she was. No one moved. Mercer turned toward him, offended again, and demanded an identity. The man stepped into brighter light and gave his name as Commander Elias Rourke. Recognition rippled through the security escort, the federal liaison, and finally Bell. He was not publicly famous. He was privately consequential, which was much worse for Mercer. Rourke added that if Nurse Vale had been threatened in that corridor after saving his man's life, everyone responsible would do well to stop speaking and start documenting. Rourke did not explain himself immediately. That was intentional. He understood institutions and knew truth lands harder when those who assumed they controlled it have time to feel their own uncertainty first. Bell began moving with sudden deference, apologizing for not having been informed. Rourke replied that he had not been meant to be informed. Bell asked if the patient was stable. Rourke said the patient had a chance because of Nora. Bell looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, which in any meaningful sense he was. Ruiz explained that Mercer had just attempted a unilateral suspension. Bell turned sharply and asked whether it had been done without review. Mercer defended himself by claiming he had been protecting the institution. Rourke asked him from whom. Mercer opened his mouth and found no answer quickly enough. The federal liaison then requested immediate preservation of every electronic record tied to both emergency intakes from that night, including access logs, chart edits, internal messages, hallway cameras, order history, and disciplinary filings. Bell asked if all of that was really necessary. She answered that what was excessive was what happened when records were not preserved before accountability became inconvenient. Mercer objected that the request seemed disproportionate. She told him that timestamps would determine proportion. They moved upstairs to an executive conference room washed in late-night quiet and expensive restraint. They passed carpeted corridors, framed photographs from fundraising events, art on the walls, and the polished architecture of a hospital wing most trauma patients would never see. The obscenity of the contrast with the emergency department below was almost perfect. Nora walked beside Ruiz. Mercer walked ahead, pretending he still might be leading something. Rourke said very little. Bell kept checking his phone. The liaison carried her folder like a verdict waiting to unfold. Inside the conference room, the positions settled themselves without instruction. Rourke sat where he could face the door. Bell took the chair nearest him. The liaison chose a seat with a clear view of everyone. Ruiz sat beside Nora. Mercer selected the place most visible from the head of the table, explaining himself more efficiently by posture than by any testimony that could have followed. A legal recorder connected in. Bell opened the meeting as if it were an emergency response review and personnel dispute. Rourke corrected him. The meeting, he said, concerned whether St. Catherine's understood what had happened in its emergency department, and whether those responsible for mishandling one of the most capable clinical operators he had ever worked with intended to continue making that mistake. Mercer scoffed at the word operator and reduced Nora again to a nurse, but the room had already begun moving beyond his categories. Rourke asked Nora to recount the intake sequence on the unidentified patient from first visual assessment through transfer. He asked for timing, observations, exclusions, and why she rejected the obvious interpretation before the rest of the team did. Nora answered in plain language. She described the pressure behavior, the asymmetry, the compensatory patterns, the tactile cues, and why the room's chosen narrative did not match the body in front of them. When Bell looked lost, she translated for him. When Ruiz nodded, she continued. When Mercer shifted in irritation, she ignored him with almost surgical precision. The difference between intelligence and experience became audible. Nora's reasoning was not merely textbook deep. It was field deep. It came from places where options disappeared faster than clean conditions did. Mercer tried to interrupt twice. The first time Rourke raised one finger and Mercer stopped mid-breath without understanding why. The second time the liaison informed him that if he continued speaking over the witness, his remarks would be limited to direct questions. The word witness changed the air. Bell eventually asked where Nora had received that level of trauma pattern recognition. Ruiz looked at Nora before Nora answered. She said she had prior experience in high-acuity environments. Mercer laughed sharply and said that was not an answer. Rourke said it was the answer she was giving. Mercer demanded to know why that answer should be protected. The liaison opened her folder and explained that some records tied to Nora Vale's prior service were not part of the hospital's gossip economy. The word service landed hard. Bell asked whether this meant military background. Nora remained still. Rourke asked Mercer whether he had ever reviewed Nora's sealed credentialing endorsement. Mercer said he had not needed to. Ruiz clarified that it had been restricted. Bell admitted he had never personally reviewed it either. Rourke then explained that the hospital had accepted a recommendation package under emergency credentialing accommodation after a FEDRA continuity request. It had not been asked to publicize it, it had been asked to protect it. Bell went pale and admitted he had not been in his current role when the file was processed. Mercer tried to rescue himself by calling the entire matter theater and demanding that if there was anything relevant, it be disclosed. Bell asked why Nora had been placed there. Nora answered that she had placed herself there. Ruiz asked why. Nora said that after enough years in places built around emergency, she had wanted somewhere ordinary. She wanted a hospital where people survived because systems worked. She wanted fluorescent lights instead of rotors, shift reports instead of encrypted briefings, and a life in which she could be the least interesting person in the room. Mercer tried to mock her again, but Rourke told him very plainly that he should stop speaking. The fact that Mercer obeyed, even briefly, revealed to everyone how much the balance had already shifted. During a short recess, the liaison secured formal record preservation. Rain moved down the conference room windows in silver lines. Ruiz turned to Nora and told her she could have said something earlier. Nora said she knew. Ruiz asked if she would have been required to keep it secret. Nora said yes. Ruiz exhaled and admitted she was glad Nora had not told her. Bell, still pale, asked how sensitive the upstairs patient's identity really was. Rourke told him it was sensitive enough that he should never ask that question again in a room containing unsecured devices. Bell immediately shut off his phone. Mercer could not tolerate exclusion any longer and tried to reclaim the ground by insisting that hospitals ran on licensure, documented authority, and scope, not mythology. He argued that even if Nora had military experience of some kind, she had still disregarded physician command. Rourke repeated the phrase physician command as if considering an object of very poor craftsmanship. Then he explained that for 6 years before ever working at St. Catherine's, Nora had served in a capacity requiring trauma assessment under degraded conditions, multi-system stabilization with minimal support, and independent clinical decisions in environments where waiting for formal consensus got people killed. Mercer tried to dismiss this as ordinary combat medic experience. Rourke corrected him. It was not. He continued, explaining that Nora had been attached to cross-functional operations teams in advisory and embedded support roles no one in that room needed clearance to hear in greater detail. She had completed advanced field trauma pathways, surgical support rotations, prolonged evacuation care, and interagency protective medicine. On more than one occasion, she had kept critically injured personnel alive long enough for extraction under conditions he was not legally inclined to narrate. Nora did not look proud while he said it. She looked tired. Ruiz saw that before anyone else. People imagine hidden excellence feels gratifying when exposed. Often it feels like being dragged backward through doors one closed in order to survive. Bell asked why she had hidden any of it. Nora answered with complete honesty that she had not come there to become a story. Mercer seized on one remaining technical defense, arguing that military support experience did not make someone the ranking clinician in a civilian hospital. Nora agreed at once. The speed of her agreement disoriented him. Then she explained that while it did not change the hospital hierarchy, it should have made him more willing to listen when she warned that a body was failing in a way he was not seeing. Ruiz, still processing, asked quietly about the call sign. Rourke turned to Nora and gave her the choice. After a brief pause, she said it herself. The name had been Wren. Bell looked confused. Mercer looked irritated. Ruiz looked stricken in the strange way people do when a small detail suddenly rearranges everything behind it. Rourke explained that the men and women Nora had once worked with called her Wren because she had often been the smallest person on a team and the one most likely to notice what everyone else missed. Small bird, sharp eye, never where trouble expected her, and usually the reason people made it back. The simplicity of it struck harder than any inflated title could have. Then came evidence. The liaison returned with a secure tablet and permission to disclose a tightly limited set of facts relevant to personnel treatment and clinical authority. The commendation on the screen was heavily redacted, but not enough to blunt its force. Nora Vale's name appeared above a restricted federal clinical commendation for exceptional field stabilization under hostile conditions, preservation of life of Allied command personnel during compromised evacuation, and subsequent advisory clearance, with her civilian transition formally protected. Mercer stared at the black bars like a man trying to hate them into transparency. Bell looked sick. Ruiz read the visible lines twice before setting the device down very carefully. Rourke then said there was more. Nora objected quietly, but he told her it was time. For the first time that night, she looked not composed but conflicted, which mattered. It told Ruiz this was not modesty hiding vanity. It was someone who had worked hard not to be found by the wrong parts of her own past. Rourke explained that the man treated upstairs was not Daniel Ross at all, but a senior operations commander, whose decisions had shaped the survival of U.S. personnel and partner assets in multiple theaters. 4 years earlier, when his convoy was hit during an extraction in weather bad enough to ground half the mission, the reason he had survived long enough to come home had been Wren. Bell went absolutely still. Ruiz looked at Nora as if the air around her had changed density. Mercer tried to claw back skepticism by asking whether they were expected to believe she had saved the same man twice and simply recognized an obscure pattern because of that. Nora answered quietly that bodies repeat themselves, and fear does too. Rourke added the part no one in the room could easily survive hearing. He said that Nora had held pressure on that man for 43 minutes in a vehicle that should never have cleared the terrain it crossed. She had instructed a team leader through decompression while taking shrapnel through her own arm. She had remained conscious longer than she should have. When they finally landed, she had asked for the next patient before asking for pain control. Nobody moved. Nobody could. Bell looked like a man mentally reopening every unnoticed interaction he had ever permitted in his institution. Ruiz's eyes shone, though her voice remained steady when she observed that Nora had still come to the hospital simply to do the job. Mercer's denial had nowhere elegant left to stand, so it became smaller and meaner. He suggested that if any of this had been true, then perhaps someone should have disclosed enough to avoid confusion. Rourke's reply was glacial. Mercer was not confused, he was exposed. The second half of the reveal arrived through the least dramatic instrument in the room, the chart audit. Preserved records began appearing on the secure display. Time stamps, order entries, revisions, voice-to-text transcriptions, camera stills from the corridor. Internal messages Mercer had sent to a resident minutes after Calvin Reese was stabilized. One said they needed to align the narrative before nursing made it political. Another instructed the resident to emphasize role confusion and compromised chain. A third, sent after the high-security patient had gone upstairs, stated plainly that they were not going to let a floor nurse become the face of this. Bell's face hardened line by line. Mercer tried to call the messages private remarks stripped of context. The liaison told him that timestamps were context. Ruiz asked for the hallway footage. There it was without audio but with perfect clarity. Mercer reaching for Nora's badge before any formal review, Ruiz stepping in, staff witnessing everything, Rourke reappearing at the exact moment ritual humiliation was about to become fact. Bell looked at Mercer with open disgust and said he had wanted to make an example of her. Mercer replied that he had wanted to maintain standards. Rourke answered that he had wanted to punish someone for being right where others could see it. Bell then removed Mercer from supervisory authority pending full review. Mercer laughed because men like him often believe consequence is theater until security arrives. Bell pressed the intercom and requested hospital security and the emergency human resources representative. Mercer told Bell he lacked the backbone. Ruiz stood so slowly it became a warning and replied that Bell did not need backbone anymore. He had records. When security arrived, Bell handled the matter procedurally, which made it devastating in the best possible way. Mercer's badge privileges were suspended. Access to certain records was frozen. He was instructed not to contact involved staff pending investigation. Witness names were documented. The liaison requested copies of the messages. Ruiz insisted on resident statements before mentoring could become pressure. No one shouted him down. No one turned the moment into spectacle. They did something better. They made the institution operate in the direction of truth. By dawn, the first ripple had moved downstairs. Residents who had spent months imitating Mercer suddenly spoke more carefully around nurses. A charge nurse who had once shrugged off his sarcasm filed her own notes from earlier incidents. An anesthesiologist sent legal a concise email offering observations relevant to pattern. People did not become brave because justice appeared. They became brave because someone had finally shown them the structure might hold. Nora did not watch much of that unfold. After leaving the conference room, she asked only whether the patient upstairs was going to make it. Rourke told her he had a chance because of her. Ruiz noticed that Nora had not really stopped moving since the intake and insisted on taking her to a quieter consult room near the surgical elevators. The lights were softer there. Someone had left a folded blanket on a chair. The hum of the hospital softened into distant ventilation and faraway footsteps. For half a minute, neither woman spoke. Then Ruiz apologized, not for a specific decision, but for allowing the hospital to become a room where a man like Mercer could make someone like Nora feel small. Nora looked toward the window where the black sky had only just begun to soften and said he had not made her feel small. He had only made her feel tired. That answer hurt Ruiz more than outrage would have. When Ruiz asked when Nora had planned to tell her any of it, Nora answered honestly that she had never intended to if she could help it. Ruiz asked why. Nora explained that once people knew what a person had been in hard places, they often stopped letting that person be ordinary in easier ones. Ruiz had no answer. Mercer made one final mistake before sunrise. He tried to call a donor board member from a restricted office in the hope of slowing the investigation through influence. The call never connected. His communications had already been narrowed, the attempt was flagged, and the effort itself became another entry in the growing record explaining why he could no longer be trusted with informal power. By the time he understood how completely the ground had moved under him, it was too late. Bell, to his credit, learned quickly once fear made him teachable. He convened an emergency administrative review the next morning, included nursing leadership at equal weight, and instructed legal to prepare formal protection notices for everyone involved in the overnight events. Ruiz submitted not only her statement, but prior informal notes she had kept on Mercer's behavior because formal escalation had once felt useless under the old culture. Residents, sensing that Mercer was no longer safe to imitate, gave neat, devastating statements in administrative language. Dismissive of nursing input, public belittling, pressure to align documentation, hostility after contradiction. One admitted Mercer had explicitly warned him not to romanticize floor-level heroics after Nora saved Calvin Reese. At the same time, the security team assigned to the high-status patient did something that mattered more than gossip. They treated Nora with unobtrusive respect. One of them thanked her in passing without flourish. Another left coffee outside the consult room door and walked away before she opened it. Rourke stayed nearby without hovering. He understood that being seen too quickly by too many people would feel like another kind of pressure. Word came from surgery around 8:20 that the patient was out of the operating room and alive. Not safe, but alive. Nora closed her eyes then and let out a breath so slowly Ruiz realized she had been holding herself against that uncertainty all night. Rourke stepped into the doorway and told her the patient had asked whether Wren was real or whether he had imagined hearing her voice. That finally drew the smallest laugh from her. Later that afternoon, Bell held a formal staff communication in the education auditorium. His motives were probably not entirely noble. Scandal prevention often resembles ethics from a distance, but results matter. Nurses came skeptical, residents anxious, technicians practical. Mercer was absent, and his absence made more noise than his presence ever had. Bell addressed the overnight events, praised team response, acknowledged that the hospital had failed to create a workplace where all licensed professionals could raise urgent clinical concerns without fear of humiliation, and announced immediate review of physician conduct and interdisciplinary authority practices. Then he put the matter in plain language. A nurse on the staff, he said, had identified critical findings twice in one night under conditions where delay would likely have cost lives, and that nurse had afterward been subjected to an inappropriate disciplinary threat. It should never have happened there. He did not name Nora immediately. That was wise. When he finally asked her to step forward from the side aisle where she had tried to remain half out of sight, the room did not erupt into applause. Ruiz had warned Bell against that kind of cheap spectacle. Instead, the entire room stood in silence. Rows of nurses, residents, technicians, and administrators rose together not to celebrate, but to shape respect into something visible. Nora looked out at them, and for one uncertain second seemed almost overwhelmed, not by attention itself, but by the cleanliness of it. Bell stated that Nurse Nora Vale had the hospital's thanks, its respect, and goy. NG forward, its explicit institutional protection. It was the closest thing to public correction Mercer's chosen weapon could receive. Mercer's formal confrontation happened elsewhere, in a smaller room and with less theater, but its consequences were heavier. HR Legal Bell, an external reviewer, and department heads walked him through sequence, witness corroboration, messages, prior complaints, and his attempted donor contact. He objected to tone, process, and what he called career destruction over interpersonal friction. Then the external reviewer asked one devastating question. When Nora contradicted him in the Reese case and proved correct, why had he filed against her instead of documenting the save? Mercer answered too quickly that the issue had never been whether she happened to be right. The reviewer repeated the phrase "happened to be right," and the logic closed around him. If being right had not mattered, then hierarchy had. If hierarchy mattered more than patient safety when his pride was involved, then his fitness for supervision was compromised. His leave was imposed that day, and referral to the medical board followed. When Ruiz later told Nora it was done, Nora thanked her and asked almost nothing else. Ruiz watched her and observed that she really did not need revenge. Nora answered that she had only needed him not to keep doing it. That was the most accurate thing anyone said about her all week. The private fulfillment of everything that had changed came in a recovery suite under low light, where the city glowed through half-closed blinds and machines whispered instead of screamed. The patient whose name remained officially unspoken had survived surgery and drifted in and out of consciousness. Guards remained nearby, but the atmosphere had softened. Rourke met Nora outside the door and told her the patient was awake enough for a minute, maybe two. She remarked that she was not dressed for reunions. Rourke replied that she had not been dressed for the first one either. Inside, the patient looked older than he had on the gurney. Pain and survival do that to people. Tubes ran neatly. The monitors glowed in patient colors. His eyes found her almost at once. Even exhausted and sedated, he recognized her. He indicated with dry humor that if he was seeing her, either he was doing very well or very badly. Nora stepped closer and observed that he was at least alive enough to complain. Rourke stayed near the door and looked away, granting privacy in the only way some soldiers know how, by pretending not to witness what they would defend with their lives. The man studied Nora's face and admitted he had heard her voice in the trauma bay and thought the medication was inventing things. She told him he had been wrong about that. A tired smile touched his mouth and faded. He asked whether she had pulled him out of another bad night. Nora answered, as she always did, by minimizing herself. She said she had only bought time and the surgeons had done the rest. He told her that was not modesty but her usual lie. The silence between them was not awkward. It was full. Then he told her she was still making the impossible possible. That recognition changed her expression in a way no one downstairs had seen all day. Something softened around the exhaustion. It was not pride, exactly. It was relief, the relief of being known accurately by someone who had seen her in the hardest years and still led with gratitude. She told him to rest. He told her that she should let people know what she was. She answered no at once. When he asked why, she told him simply that she was a nurse. His eyes warmed, and he agreed. Yes, she was. After that, the hospital had to learn how to live with the truth, or at least with the portion of truth it was permitted to hold. Not the classified fragments buried behind black bars and federal silence, but the simpler truth that quiet had been mistaken for lesser, that polished ego had been allowed to outrank disciplined observation, and that the institution had nearly punished the person best equipped to save it from its own habits. Changes followed. Interdisciplinary escalation rules were rewritten so nurses could formally trigger higher-level review during acute disagreements without immediate retaliation. Trauma simulations were updated to score role-neutral recognition. Anonymous reporting channels were routed externally. Nursing leadership received permanent seats in certain review pathways Bell had once treated as physician-led territory. Those changes sounded procedural because that is how justice survives after speeches end. Residents began asking Nora real questions, not hero worship questions or invasive questions, but practical ones. They wanted to know how she noticed, what she looked at first, and when she trusted a pattern that did not fit the room's consensus. She answered whenever the subject was patience. She declined whenever the subject was war, most P. Eupple respected the boundary. Those who did not learned quickly from Ruiz that curiosity was not entitlement. Mercer's absence lingered longer than his presence ever should have. A few loyalists tried to reframe what had happened as politics or institutional overcorrection, but without Mercer's gravity behind them, they sounded thin. Behavior that depends on intimidation rarely appears impressive in daylight. Calvin Reese, the sanitation supervisor from the first crisis, sent a handwritten note 2 weeks later. He knew nothing of commanders, call signs, or federal commendations. He only knew that a nurse had listened when others did not. He thanked Nora for not letting them send him home to die because he looked ordinary. She kept that card. Of everything spoken about her after the fact, it understood the story best. Weeks passed and the building settled. Scandal became policy. Policy became memory. Memory became culture shift in progress. Nora stayed, which surprised almost everyone except Ruiz. When Ruiz admitted she had expected Nora to leave for somewhere better, Nora said she had possessed better options before. Ruiz asked why she remained. Nora looked down the corridor where a new resident was helping an older nurse move heavy equipment without being asked, a tiny sign of a room learning better habits, and answered that the hospital might finally learn. Ruiz told her that made her impossible. Nora corrected her by saying she was only persistent. Rourke visited once more before disappearing back into the invisible architecture of his own world. This time there was no entourage and no emergency, just a man in a dark coat waiting near the ambulance bay at shift chain, while cold wind carried wrappers along the curb, and the city made its usual siren-laced music beyond the gates. Nora came out holding a paper bag with food she would probably forget to eat. She told him he was not a subtle visitor. He replied that he had parked 3 blocks away. She told him he still walked like a commander. He said that was a permanent injury. Then he grew serious and told her the patient was recovering. She said she knew. He added that the patient had asked whether she would visit again. She said no. Rourke accepted that. He also said the patient had asked whether she was happy. Nora looked toward the ambulance entrance where chaos would always return eventually and answered that she was useful. Rourke told her that was not the same answer. She said it was close enough for now. He watched her for a moment and admitted that none of them had ever thought she was meant to disappear. Nora said that sometimes disappearing was the only way to remain a person. He did not argue. He only saluted her then, not theatrically but privately, with exactness under hospital lights where no audience could turn the gesture into legend. Nora's breath caught by a fraction. Because her hands were full, she returned the salute with 2 fingers against the edge of the paper bag, and the imperfection somehow kept the moment honest. The final public vindication came from the least expected place. The annual Clinical Excellence Award at St. Catherine's had historically gone to physicians with glossy biographies and donor-friendly narratives. That year, under revised committee structure and careful scrutiny, it went to nurse Nora Vale for extraordinary clinical judgment, interdisciplinary leadership under pressure, and exemplary service. She tried to decline it. Ruiz refused to let her. It was not a crown, Ruiz told her. It was a correction. So Nora stood on a small stage in the hospital atrium beneath soft lights and too many flower arrangements while administrators clapped and staff gathered at the edges. Bell kept his speech shorter than he had wanted because Ruiz had threatened to stop him if he made the moment about institutional redemption. When he handed Nora the plaque, he said only that she had made them better than they had been. That was the right thing to say. Nora stepped to the microphone like someone approaching a machine she did not trust. Anyone expecting a grand address received only 3 sentences. She said she was honored. She said no one in the building saved lives alone. Then she asked everyone present to keep listening to the quiet people in their rooms because they were usually busy noticing what pride missed. That line moved through St. Catherine's faster than any memo Bell ever issued. Mercer heard about it too, well outside the daily rhythm of the hospital by then, and the echo was fitting. Years later, people would tell the story badly, as people always do. Some would make Nora too mysterious. Some would make Mercer too monstrous. Some would inflate the medicine and dramatize the danger, turning a chain of disciplined decisions into myth. But the truth worth keeping was simpler and better. A quiet nurse had been underestimated. A crisis arrived. She saw what louder people missed. She acted. They tried to punish her. Authority entered. The truth came out. Justice happened through records, witnesses, policy, and courage. In the end, the people who mattered most did not honor her because she had once worked in extraordinary places. They honored her because in an ordinary hospital, under ordinary lights, with ordinary people depending on her, she remained exactly who she had always been when it counted: calm, precise, dignified, and useful. That was harder than drama and rarer than talent. It was character. The loudest person in the room had not been the clearest thinker. The most polished title had not belonged to the steadiest hands. The person everyone talked over had been the one holding the line between order and irreversible regret. When truth finally entered the room, it had not needed to shout. It had only needed to become undeniable. Some nights after long shifts, Nora still walked past the ambulance bay and paused under the awning to listen to the city breathe. Tires hissed over wet pavement. Helicopters moved far off. Sirens rose and fell beyond the hospital walls. The doors sighed open for strangers in need. She never became loud. She never became interested in looking impressive. She kept teaching when asked, correcting when necessary, and disappearing back into work before admiration could settle too heavily on her shoulders. New nurses loved her not because of the stories, but because she made hard rooms feel survivable. She noticed when their hands shook and gave them one useful task instead of one embarrassing question. When they made mistakes, she fixed the patient first and the shame second. On the worst nights, she looked like proof that composure could be learned. Every so often, when a resident started mistaking confidence for entitlement, someone older would lean over and say quietly that they might want to listen to Nora. That became enough. Perhaps that is why the story felt true even as fiction. Most people will never stand in a trauma bay while a commander whispers a forgotten call sign. Most people will never discover that a quiet coworker once held lives together in places no one can safely describe. But almost everyone has seen a room misjudge a person who did not advertise themselves. Almost everyone has watched confidence get rewarded while diligence gets overlooked. Almost everyone has wondered whether decency and competence can still win when vanity seems to own the microphone. The answer, at least here, was yes. Not quickly, not easily, but yes. Yes, when someone keeps their standards even under insult. Yes, when witnesses tell the truth. Yes, when records are preserved. Yes, when authority finally serves justice instead of ego. And yes, when the quiet person refuses to become cruel simply because cruelty would finally be allowed. So the name worth remembering was not Wren alone, and not Nora Vale alone, but the ordinary shape she chose for herself when extraordinary things were no longer what she wanted. She was the nurse who kept doing the job while lesser people performed importance around her. She was the woman who warned them without begging, stood with her badge in her own hand while a man tried to reduce her in public, and watched him discover too late that he had chosen the wrong witness. She was the one who heard the whisper, absorbed the silence that followed, and returned to work. She was the one who did not need revenge to expose cruelty. She only needed a moment that made truth visible. Mercer gave her that moment with his own hands. Rourke recognized it. Ruiz protected it. The hospital finally learned from it. And the people who lived because of it carried that knowledge forward whether or not they ever spoke her name outside secure walls. In the end, the impossible was not magic. It was only what competence looked like to people who had never had to earn it.